Hey friends, tonight we begin with a name almost everyone thinks they know. A man whose story appears in schoolbooks, documentaries, and history channels all over the world. A traveler from Venice who supposedly crossed deserts, mountains, and empires, who spent years inside the court of one of the most powerful rulers in human history, and who returned home with stories that completely changed how Europe imagined the East. His name was Marco Polo, and if you grew up hearing his story, it probably sounded something like this. A young Venetian merchant travels across the Silk Road, reaches the court of Kublai Khan, spends nearly 24 years exploring Asia, and later writes a book that opens an entirely new window onto the world. It is one of the most famous travel stories ever told. But here is the strange part. Over the last century, historians have started asking a very quiet, very uncomfortable question. What if large parts of Marco Polo's story never actually happened? What if the man whose adventures filled libraries, whose journeys inspired explorers, whose name became legendary, was not quite the traveler we think he was? Some researchers believe that parts of his story were exaggerated. Others think entire journeys may have been borrowed from other travelers, and a few historians have even suggested something far more dramatic, that Marco Polo may never have reached China at all. No Great Wall descriptions, no tea culture mentioned, no clear record of him in Mongol archives, just a fascinating book, written years later, while he was sitting in a prison cell. So tonight, we're going to slow down and carefully follow the trail. From the busy trading streets of Venice, across the legendary Silk Road, into the court of the Mongol Empire, and into one of the most intriguing historical mysteries ever told. Was Marco Polo truly the great explorer history remembers, or was he, perhaps, one of the most successful storytellers the world has ever known? Get comfortable, dim the lights, settle in, because this is a long, quiet journey through one of history's most famous and most questionable travel stories. And tonight, we're going to take our time with it. Let's begin at the beginning, which is, appropriately enough, a little unclear. Marco Polo was born in Venice in 1254, probably. The exact date is one of those things historians agree on in the same way people agree on where to go for dinner. There's a general consensus, but nobody's really happy about it. His father was Niccolo Polo, his uncle was Maffeo Polo. Both of them were merchants, which in 13th century Venice basically meant they were respectable adventurers with a commercial agenda. Venice, at this time, was one of the most powerful trading cities in the Mediterranean. It sat at the crossroads of East and West, and the Venetians had turned commerce into something approaching a civic religion. If you were born into a Venetian merchant family in 1254, you were born into a world where distant travel wasn't just romantic, it was the family business. Here's the thing about Marco's early life, though. His father and uncle had already been to the East before Marco was even old enough to be annoying. Niccolo and Maffeo set out on a trading journey around 1260, before Marco was born, and they ended up traveling all the way to the court of Kublai Khan in China, which was, by any measure, an extraordinary thing for two Italian merchants to do in the 13th century. They eventually came back in 1269, by which point Marco was about 15 years old. And here's a charming detail. Marco had never met his father before. His mother had died while Niccolo was away. Marco had been raised by relatives, so the first time Marco Polo met his father, he was a teenager, and his father said essentially, "Hello, son. I've been to China. Want to come back with me?" And Marco said yes. Of course he did. What else was he going to do? Stay in Venice and learn accounting? The second journey of the Polo brothers, and now Marco, began in 1271. Marco was 17 years old. They set out from Venice, traveled through the Middle East, across Persia, through Central Asia, over the Pamir Mountains, across the Gobi Desert, and eventually arrived at the court of Kublai Khan in 1275. That's 4 years of travel. 4 years of mountains and deserts and roads. that were less roads and more suggestions. Now, if you've ever read The Travels of Marco Polo, or more likely, if you've read a summary of it, you know that what follows is a remarkable account of life at the Mongol court, of Chinese cities, of trade routes and customs and geography. Marco claims to have served Kublai Khan as an administrator and envoy. He claims to have governed the city of Yangzhou for 3 years. He describes cities of impossible size and wealth, technologies that Europe wouldn't develop for centuries, and a civilization so sophisticated that it made Venice look like a minor footnote. And for about 600 years, people mostly believed him. Then gradually, scholars started reading more carefully. The problems begin almost immediately if you know what to look for. Let's start with the most frequently cited issue: the Great Wall of China. Marco Polo traveled through China for approximately 17 years, according to his own account. He visited major cities, served in the imperial administration, traveled widely across the country. And yet, in his entire book, he does not mention the Great Wall of China once. Not once. Now, the Great Wall, or at least significant portions of it, existed during this period. It had been built and rebuilt across centuries. It was, by any reasonable description, impossible to miss, and Marco Polo missed it, or rather, he didn't mention it. Which are not quite the same thing, but the omission is striking enough that historians have been arguing about it for over 100 years. The defenses that Polo supporters put forward are, to be fair, somewhat reasonable. The Great Wall, as we picture it today, the dramatic, photogenic thing on postcards, is largely a Ming dynasty construction. The wall that existed during the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty, when Marco was supposedly in China, was less unified, less impressive, and in places quite deteriorated. The Mongols, having conquered from the north, had little use for walls designed to keep out northern invaders, so maybe Marco just didn't find it worth mentioning, maybe. The second problem is tea. Marco Polo does not mention tea, not once. In 17 years in China, allegedly traveling widely, serving in the imperial court, visiting cities and provinces and countryside, he never mentions the most ubiquitous beverage in Chinese civilization. He describes food. He describes wine. He describes various customs of eating and drinking. He does not mention tea. This is a bit like someone claiming to have lived in England for 17 years and never noticing that people there are slightly obsessed with a hot, brown drink. The tea omission bothers historians more than you might expect, because tea wasn't just a casual habit in Yuan dynasty China. It was central to daily life, to commerce, to ceremony. If you spent 17 years embedded in Chinese society, you would encounter tea roughly every 30 minutes. It would be the background radiation of daily life. Marco Polo somehow missed it. Then there's the issue of Chinese writing. Marco Polo describes Chinese cities in extraordinary detail. He describes their size, their layout, their markets, their populations. He is clearly a sharp observer of certain things, geography, commerce, military organization. But he never describes Chinese writing or printing. This matters because China in the 13th century had developed printing technology centuries before Europe. Books were being produced at industrial scale. Paper money, which Marco does mention to his credit, was printed. Documents were everywhere. A man serving in the imperial administration would have encountered written Chinese constantly, and yet he describes none of it. No mention of the characters, the brushwork, the printing presses, nothing. Some historians find this deeply suspicious. Others argue that Marco was a merchant, an administrator, not a scholar, and that he simply wasn't interested in things like writing systems. This is possible. Some people are genuinely unobservant about certain categories of things. We all have blind spots, but the accumulation of omissions, the wall, the tea, the writing, chopsticks, foot binding, which was extremely widespread in this period and which Marco never mentions, starts to feel less like selective attention and more like someone who wasn't actually there. Let's pause here and introduced the most provocative theory about Marco Polo, which was put forward most forcefully by a British historian named Francis Wood in a 1995 book called Did Marco Polo Go to China? Wood's argument, stated simply, is this: Marco Polo probably never went to China. He probably traveled as far as Persia or possibly Central Asia, and then compiled his account of China and the East from other sources: Persian merchants, Arab traders, other travel accounts that were in circulation at the time. This would explain the omissions. If you're assembling an account from second-hand sources, you'll get the big things, the major cities, the general geography, the spectacular aspects of the imperial court. But you'll miss the mundane, ubiquitous details that you can only know from being there. The tea. The Great Wall you'd inevitably walk past. The writing system you'd encounter every day. Wood also points out that there is no mention of Marco Polo in any Chinese source from the period. The Yuan dynasty kept extremely detailed records, court appointments were documented, foreign visitors were noted. If Marco Polo truly served as an imperial administrator and governed a city for 3 years, there should be some trace of him in Chinese bureaucratic records. There is none. Not a single Chinese document from the period mentions Marco Polo, his father, or his uncle. Now the counter-argument is that Marco Polo was one of many foreign officials in Yuan dynasty's service, and that the specific records that might have mentioned him may simply not have survived. Chinese dynastic transitions were often destructive to records. The replacement of the Yuan by the Ming in 1368 was a particularly chaotic period. This is a legitimate point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as anyone who has ever tried to find a parking ticket they were sure they threw away will understand. But it adds to the pile. Let's talk about the book itself, because the book is complicated in its own fascinating way. Marco Polo did not write the book. He dictated it, or more precisely, he told his story to a man named Rustichello da Pisa, who wrote it down. This happened around 1298, when both men were prisoners in Genoa after a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. Rustichello was, by occupation, a writer of popular romances. He wrote the kind of adventures featuring knights and kings and impossible deeds that were the medieval equivalent of airport thriller novels. He was good at his job, which means he was skilled at making things exciting and dramatic, and occasionally not entirely constrained by reality. This is relevant because who shaped the narrative? How much of what's in the book is Marco Polo's careful memory, and how much is Rustichello making things sound better? The book went through multiple manuscript versions, and these versions differ from each other in sometimes significant ways. Some details appear in one version and not others. Some numbers are different. The book was copied by hand for 2 centuries, before printing, which introduced its own distortions. So even if we believe Marco went to China, we're reading a document that passed through a professional storyteller, was transcribed by hand dozens of times, and exists in versions that disagree with each other on various points. The epistemological ground here is not firm, and yet there are things in Marco Polo's account that are simply too accurate to be easily dismissed. He describes the burning of black stones for heat. This is coal, which was used extensively in China but was not known in Europe at the time. He describes paper money, which is accurate, and was a Chinese innovation that Europeans would not adopt for centuries. He describes the imperial postal relay system, which archaeological and historical evidence confirms was real and remarkably sophisticated. He describes asbestos, which he explains correctly, as a mineral rather than, as European legend had it, a fiber from a fireproof salamander. These are not things you could easily get right from a Persian trader's second-hand account. They're specific, accurate, and in some cases describe things that were genuinely unknown in Europe. So the honest answer to did Marco Polo lie about everything is probably no. But the honest answer to did he go to China is we genuinely don't know. He may have gone and been a poor observer of certain things. He may have gone only part of the way and supplemented his account with other sources. He may have done something in between traveling as far as Central Asia, gathering information from traders and travelers, and producing an account that mixed genuine experience with second-hand material. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the book that bears his name changed European understanding of the East in ways that were genuinely consequential. Whether or not every detail is accurate, it opened a conceptual door. It told Europeans that there was a vastly wealthy, technologically sophisticated civilization to the east, and that this civilization was worth knowing about. Christopher Columbus had a copy of Marco Polo's book with him when he sailed west in 1492. He was famously trying to reach Cathay. He made notes in the margins of his copy of Polo's travels, so even if Marco Polo embellished, even if he invented large parts of his journey, the consequences of his book were entirely real. There's something almost poetic about that. A possibly fabricated journey that redirected the course of actual history. Marco Polo returned to Venice around 1295. He had been gone for 24 years. He was 41 years old. His relatives reportedly didn't recognize him when he arrived. He and his father and uncle had been presumed dead. He allegedly arrived in ragged Eastern clothing, speaking Italian with an odd accent, and carrying what appeared to be jewels sewn into the linings of his garments. Whether this detail is true or a later embellishment is, at this point, entirely in keeping with everything else we know about Marco Polo. He got married, had 3 daughters, became a reasonably successful merchant, and lived the rest of his life in Venice without making any further remarkable journeys. He died in 1324 at the age of approximately 70. His will survives, and it's notably boring, a document about property and debts and the mundane business of an old Venetian merchant settling his affairs. His reported last words, or near last words, are possibly too good to be true. When urged by those around his deathbed to retract the more fantastic claims in his book, he allegedly said, "I have not told half of what I saw," which is either the statement of a man defending his honest account or the most perfectly calibrated parting, shot by one of history's great storytellers. Either way, it's a good line. Let's turn our attention now to another traveler of the medieval world, one whose journeys were at least as extensive as Marco Polo's, whose account is at least as remarkable, and who is significantly less famous in the Western world, possibly because he was not European, and history has a way of deciding whose adventures get remembered. His name was Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was born in Tangier, in what is now Morocco, in 1304. He died sometime around 1368 or 1369, the exact date is, in keeping with medieval biographical traditions, somewhat uncertain. In between those two dates, he traveled approximately 75,000 miles. Let that number sit there for a moment. 5,000 miles in the 14th century. On foot, on horseback, by camel, by boat, by whatever means of transport was available in whichever part of the world he happened to be crossing at the time. For comparison, Marco Polo's journey, if we take it at face value, covered roughly 15,000 miles. Ibn Battuta traveled 5 times as far. He visited the equivalent of roughly 44 modern countries. He spent approximately 29 years in active travel, which is longer than many people's entire careers. He is the most extensive pre-modern traveler in recorded history. And if you went to school in the Western world, there's a reasonable chance you have never heard of him. This is one of history's more glaring oversights, and we're going to spend some time correcting it tonight. Ibn Battuta was born in Tangier, in what is now Morocco, in 1304. He died sometime around 1368 or 1369. The exact date is, in keeping with medieval biographical traditions, somewhat uncertain. In between those two dates, he traveled approximately 75,000 miles. Let that number sit there for a moment. 5,000 miles in the 14th century, on foot, on horseback, by camel, by boat, by whatever means of transport was available in whichever part of the world he happened to be crossing at the time. For comparison, Marco Polo's journey, if we take it at face value, covered roughly 15,000 miles. Ibn Battuta traveled 5 times as far. He visited the equivalent of roughly 44 modern countries. He spent approximately 29 years in active travel, which is longer than many people's entire careers. He is the most extensive pre-modern traveler in recorded history. And if you went to school in the Western world, there's a reasonable chance you have never heard of him. This is one of history's more glaring oversights, and we're going to spend some time correcting it tonight. Ibn Battuta's first journey began in 1325 when he was 21 years old. He set out from Tangier on the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, which is, on the face of it, a pious and straightforward undertaking. He was gone for 24 years. The Hajj, for reference, does not take 24 years. You could, in the 14th century, complete the pilgrimage from North Africa in perhaps a year or two of travel, including the time in Mecca itself. Ibn Battuta completed his first pilgrimage. Then he decided to keep going. He traveled through Egypt up to Syria, back down to Mecca for another pilgrimage, then sailed down the East African coast as far as what is now Tanzania, came back up to the Persian Gulf, traveled through Persia and Iraq, went back to Mecca for yet another pilgrimage, traveled across Anatolia, crossed the Black Sea to the territory of the Golden Horde, made a detour to Constantinople, which was still a Christian Byzantine city at this point, traveled across the Central Asian steppe, passed through Afghanistan, crossed into India, and arrived at the Sultanate of Delhi, and that's roughly the first 12 years. In Delhi, Ibn Battuta did something that Marco Polo also allegedly did at the Mongol court, which was get a government job. He was appointed as a judge, a qadi, by the Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Muhammad bin Tughlaq is himself one of the more fascinating figures in medieval Indian history, and we'll spend a little time with him because he's exactly the kind of person this channel exists to discuss. He was, by most accounts, extremely intelligent. He was also, by most accounts, profoundly unstable in his decision-making. These two qualities combined in ways that were catastrophically expensive for his kingdom. His most famous decision was to move the capital of his entire empire from Delhi to a city called Daulatabad, roughly 700 miles to the south. This involved forcibly relocating the entire population of Delhi, approximately 1 million people by some estimates, on a march across difficult terrain in harsh conditions. Many people died. Then a few years later, he changed his mind and moved the capital back to Delhi, which involved another forced march of approximately 1 million people across difficult terrain. More people died. Ibn Battuta describes all of this with the slightly careful tone of a man who is employed by the person he's describing and would like to remain employed. He also describes the Sultan's other notable policy experiments, which included minting copper coins as legal tender at the value of gold and silver coins, which predictably caused runaway counterfeiting and inflation that wrecked the Delhi economy for years, and a failed military expedition to the Himalayas that destroyed an entire army. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was, in fairness, a man ahead of his time in certain respects. He had genuine intellectual interests and employed scholars and artists generously. He was also a man who would execute people for fairly minor offenses with a kind of casual efficiency that his courtiers found, understandably, anxiety-inducing. Ibn Battuta spent 8 years at the Delhi court, walking a careful line between useful service and not saying anything that might get him killed. He describes several instances of courtiers being executed for perceived slights. He describes his own near brushes with the Sultan's displeasure with a detachment that reads as either philosophical acceptance or very effective professional anxiety management. Ibn Battuta eventually left India on a diplomatic mission. He was sent by the Sultan to China, which is a nice parallel to our earlier subject. He set out with an enormous retinue, including horses, slaves, gifts, and enough provisions for a substantial journey. Then everything went wrong almost immediately. His fleet was caught in a storm near the Indian coast. Several ships sank. Ibn Battuta's own ship was driven away from the harbor where the rest of his party was sheltering. When he made his way back to the coast, he found that his entire retinue, the horses, the gifts, the people, had been captured by local rebels. He had arrived in India years before with nothing but ambition and ended up wealthy and employed. Now he had lost everything again. He was stranded on the coast of India, broke, in a region that was in active revolt with no way to return to Delhi, partly because he was afraid that the Sultan would hold him responsible for losing the diplomatic mission and have him executed. This was by any measure a bad day. Ibn Battuta did what Ibn Battuta characteristically did in bad situations, which was adapt, travel to somewhere else, find new employment, and continue moving. He spent time in the Maldive Islands, where he was again appointed as a judge. He describes the Maldives with the affection of someone who has just escaped a very stressful situation and found himself somewhere genuinely pleasant. The islands were peaceful, the people were hospitable, the food was good. He also, while in the Maldives, got married several times actually. Ibn Battuta was married and divorced with what his modern biographers describe diplomatically as frequency. He had wives in multiple countries. He had children he never saw again after moving on from a particular city. He was not, by any reading of his account, a man who let domestic commitments interfere with travel plans. This is mentioned not to judge him. Marriage customs were different, the context was different, but because it's a genuinely distinctive aspect of his personality. Ibn Battuta moved through the world with an extraordinary capacity for establishing himself, making connections, finding patrons and employment and spouses, and then moving on. He was a fundamentally restless person who had turned restlessness into a vocation. He eventually made it to China. Unlike Marco Polo's China, Ibn Battuta's China in the 1340s was a China already showing signs of the instability that would bring down the Yuan dynasty. There were famines and floods and peasant rebellions in the provinces. The careful order that Marco Polo describes from 7 decades earlier was fraying at the edges. Ibn Battuta's account of China is interesting, partly for what he found remarkable. He was consistently struck by the sophistication of Chinese manufacturing, the ceramics, the silk, the technical skill of Chinese craftspeople. He describes Chinese painters with particular admiration, noting that they could produce portraits of remarkable accuracy. He also found China somewhat unsettling in a way that says something about him and his world. China was not a Muslim country. The cultural context was entirely different from anything he'd experienced in the Islamic world, which had been the framework for most of his travels. He describes feeling like a stranger in a way that he hadn't felt elsewhere, even in Christian, Constantinople or Buddhist territories. There's something humanizing about this. A man who had traveled 50,000 miles and adapted to dozens of cultures, and who still found one place genuinely foreign. Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco around 1349, after nearly a quarter century of travel. He was 45 years old. His parents had died while he was away. Morocco had been struck by the Black Death in his absence. He returned to a country that had been devastated by plague. Most people, at this point, would have stayed home. Ibn Battuta went to Spain. Then he crossed the Sahara and traveled into sub-Saharan Africa, visiting the Mali Empire, which was at the height of its wealth and power. He met the Malian ruler, described the city of Timbuktu, and provided one of the earliest detailed accounts of West African civilization that survives from any source. He finally returned to Morocco in 1354, where the Sultan of Morocco commissioned his travel account. As with Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta did not write the book himself. It was written in collaboration with a scholar named Ibn Juzai, who took Ibn Battuta's dictated account and edited it into a coherent narrative. The book is called, in English, A Gift to Those Who Contemplate the Wonders of Cities and the Marvels of Traveling, which is a significantly better title than the Travels of Marco Polo, and we should acknowledge this. And here, in the spirit of fairness, we should note that scholars have raised some of the same questions about Ibn Battuta that they raise about Marco Polo. Some passages in his book appear to borrow descriptions from earlier travel accounts. Some of his dates don't quite add up. Some places he describes visiting don't seem to have records of his presence, which is, as we discussed with Marco Polo, not necessarily conclusive, but is notable. There are also passages that seem physically impossible, describing being in two distant places within time frames that make the journey between them implausible even by modern transportation standards, let alone 14th century one. The consensus among scholars is that Ibn Battuta certainly traveled extensively, but that his account was probably shaped by the same forces that shaped Marco Polo's: memory imperfection, the input of a literary collaborator, a desire to make the account comprehensive and impressive, and possibly some supplementation with second-hand information for places he may have visited only briefly or heard about from others. This doesn't make the accounts worthless. It makes them what they are: remarkable documents produced by remarkable people, filtered through the technologies and conventions of their time, which we should read with interest and with appropriate care. Let's now move from individual travelers to something larger, which is the world they were traveling through. Because the 13th and 14th centuries, in the era of both Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, were centuries of extraordinary movement, connection, and catastrophe. This was the era of the Mongol Empire, which at its height controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Central Europe. And while the Mongols are famous for their conquests, which were genuinely staggering in their scale and violence, they are less famous for what the empire made possible after the conquests were done: the Mongol Peace, Pax Mongolica. For roughly a century, the Mongol Empire maintained enough stability across Central Asia that the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, functioned at a level of efficiency and safety it had not achieved before and would not achieve again for centuries. This is the world Marco Polo traveled through. The roads were, relatively speaking, open. The Mongol postal relay system he describes, the Yam, was real and remarkably functional. A traveler with the right papers could move across thousands of miles of Central Asian steppe with some reasonable expectation of not being robbed and murdered at every step. This didn't mean it was comfortable or safe. People died on the silk, rode constantly from disease, from weather, from bandits who hadn't gotten the memo about Mongol authority, from the sheer brutality of crossing deserts and mountain ranges. But the infrastructure was there in a way it hadn't been before. And then the Mongol peace ended, and something much worse arrived: the Black Death. The plague that devastated Europe in the 1340s and 1350s, killing somewhere between a third and half the population of the continent, traveled the same Silk Road that Marco Polo had used 70 years earlier. The network that had made trade and travel possible also made disease transmission possible. The plague likely originated in Central Asia, possibly in the area around the Tian Shan Mountains, where it had been present in rodent populations for a long time. It spread westward along the trade routes, reaching the Black Sea ports in 1346, crossing into Europe via Sicily in 1347, and spreading across the continent with terrifying speed. Ibn Battuta traveled through this world. He describes arriving in cities that had been devastated by plague. He describes the mortality, the disruption, the altered landscapes of communities that had lost enormous fractions of their populations. He kept traveling anyway, which tells you something about the man. The 14th century was, in retrospect, one of the most catastrophically difficult centuries in recorded human history. The Black Death alone killed approximately 50 million people. Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa all experienced massive population loss. The psychological and social consequences were profound and long-lasting, and yet this same century produced Ibn Battuta and produced the flowering of Islamic scholarship he traveled through, and produced the Mali Empire at its peak, and produced, in Europe, the early stirrings of the Renaissance that would transform Western civilization. History has this quality. The worst times and the most creative times are often the same times, because catastrophe disrupts the established order, creates space for new thinking, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, produces remarkable people who respond to disorder with curiosity rather than paralysis. Marco Polo traveled in the aftermath of Mongol conquest. Ibn Battuta traveled through the Black Death. Both of them kept moving, kept observing, kept writing down what they saw. Whatever exactly they saw, and however much of it they accurately recorded, the impulse itself is worth something. We've been circling around Kublai Khan for 2 parts now, and it's time to meet him properly. Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan, which is one of those ancestral facts that sounds simple and is actually the beginning of an extremely complicated story. Genghis Khan had conquered an empire of almost incomprehensible scale. He had also, in the way of successful conquerors, produced a large number of children and grandchildren who all had competing claims to pieces of that empire. By the time Kublai came along, he was born in 1215, the same year his grandfather captured Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty in northern China. The Mongol Empire was already beginning the process of sorting out which grandchild got which enormous territory. Kublai would end up with China, which was, by any measure, the prize. Kublai Khan became Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, in 1260 after a civil war with his brother Arik Böke. This civil war is worth mentioning because it illustrates something important about Kublai Khan that shaped his entire reign. He was a Mongol ruler who had become, in significant ways, more Chinese than Mongol. He preferred settled urban life to the nomadic existence of traditional Mongol culture. He surrounded himself with Chinese and other non-Mongol advisors. He established his capital at Khanbalik, the great capital, which is modern-day Beijing. He founded a Chinese-style dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and styled himself as a Chinese emperor with all the ceremonial trappings that entailed. Traditional Mongol leaders regarded this with something between suspicion and contempt. They thought Kublai had gone soft, had gone native, had traded the pure, clarifying brutality of steppe warfare for the decadent sophistication of Chinese court culture. Kublai, for his part, was running the largest empire in the world, and he found the administrative and philosophical tools of Chinese civilization more useful for that project than traditional Mongol customs designed for mobile conquest. He was not wrong about this, strictly speaking, but it did cost him the loyalty of significant portions of the Mongol world, and the civil war with his brother was the first signal that the unified Mongol Empire was beginning to fracture. Now let's talk about what Kublai Khan actually looked like, because Marco Polo describes him, and the description is interesting. Marco Polo describes Kublai as a man of medium height, neither fat nor thin. He specifies this carefully, which suggests the Khan was perhaps not quite either, with dark eyes and a complexion described as fair. He describes him as dignified in manner and impressive in person. Later portraits, which were produced during his lifetime and have survived, tell a somewhat different story. Kublai in later life was obese, genuinely, significantly obese, to the point where contemporary sources mention it. He had gout. He had what appears to have been diabetes, or at least the kind of dietary-related illness that produces similar symptoms. He drank heavily. The Mongol imperial diet was not exactly a model of nutritional balance. It was heavy on meat and fermented Mars milk, and Kublai had spent decades eating like a man who controlled a significant portion of the world's food supply. By the time of Marco Polo's visit in the 1270s and 1280s, Kublai would have been in his 60s, afflicted with gout and various other ailments, and probably looking somewhat less imperial in person than in official portraits. Marco Polo either didn't notice this, was being diplomatic, or is using the description from an earlier period of the Khan's life. Any of these is possible. Kublai Khan's reign in China was, in terms of legacy, genuinely complex. On one hand, he completed the conquest of the southern Song dynasty, unifying China for the first time in centuries. He promoted trade and commerce. He was religiously tolerant. He was nominally Buddhist, but maintained respectful relationships with Muslims, Christians, Confucians, and Taoists in his court, which was actually a fairly sophisticated approach to running a multi-ethnic empire. He supported agriculture and tried to rebuild areas damaged by conquest. On the other hand, the Mongol conquest of China had been extraordinarily violent. Entire cities were destroyed. Population estimates suggest that China may have lost somewhere between 30 and 40 million people during the Mongol conquest, though these numbers are debated by historians and the sources are imperfect. Kublai himself was less brutal than his grandfather. Almost anyone would be, since Genghis Khan had essentially industrialized destruction, but his campaigns were not gentle. He also failed, spectacularly and expensively, at two ambitious military projects, the invasions of Japan. The first invasion of Japan was in 1274. Kublai sent a fleet of approximately 900 ships and 40,000 soldiers. The Mongol forces landed in northern Kyushu and initially pushed back the Japanese defenders. Then a typhoon struck. The fleet was devastated. The surviving forces retreated. A reasonable ruler might have taken this as a signal that Japan was perhaps not worth the effort. Kublai Khan was not that kind of reasonable ruler. He sent diplomatic envoys to Japan demanding submission. The Japanese executed the envoys. This was, in Mongol terms, an act of war requiring response. In 1281, Kublai sent a second invasion force. This one was enormous, roughly 4,400 ships and somewhere between 100,000 and 140,000 soldiers, making it one of the largest amphibious operations in pre-modern history. The Japanese defenders held them off at the beaches. Then another typhoon struck. The second invasion force was, if anything, more thoroughly destroyed than the first. Contemporary sources describe ships capsized, men drowned, survivors killed or enslaved on the beaches. The disaster was so complete that it seems almost staged. The Japanese called the typhoons kamikaze, divine winds. The gods, it seemed, were on their side. Kublai Khan spent the rest of his reign contemplating a third invasion. He never launched it. Whether this was wisdom or simply running out of time and money and ships is unclear. He also tried to invade Vietnam twice. Both invasions failed. He tried to invade Java. That failed too. He sent a large expedition into Burma. This one technically succeeded in the short term but couldn't be sustained. There is a pattern here, which is that Kublai Khan was extremely good at consolidating the mainland China conquest his predecessors had begun, and significantly less good at projecting power into Southeast Asia and the maritime world. The Mongols were steppe warriors who had adapted to sedentary empire. They were not fundamentally a naval power. They tried to become one, and it cost them enormously. The failed invasions of Japan alone are estimated to have cost resources equivalent to years of the empire's revenue. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He was 79 years old, which is a remarkable age for a man of his era and habits. By the end, he was disabled by gout to the point where he had to be carried in a palanquin, and his drinking had become a serious problem. His wife Chabi, who had been one of his most important advisors and confidants, had died in 1281. His favorite son and intended heir, Zhenjin, had died in 1286. Both losses had hit him hard and contributed to what his court historians describe, with careful diplomatic language, as a period of declining health and judgment. He was succeeded by his grandson, Timur, which meant the Yuan dynasty continued. It would last until 1368, when peasant rebellions, largely a consequence of the same economic disruption and popular misery that the Black Death had exacerbated, overthrew the Mongol rulers and established the Ming dynasty. Kublai Khan's China was, in retrospect, an interlude. The Mongols ruled for about a century, which is long enough to matter but short enough that subsequent Chinese history regarded the Yuan dynasty as a foreign imposition, rather than a legitimate chapter of Chinese civilization. This is somewhat unfair to Kublai specifically, who made genuine efforts to govern China as a Chinese emperor would. But history's judgments are not always fair, which is one of the things that makes history interesting. Let's turn now to someone who was watching the Mongol Empire from what must have been a deeply uncomfortable front row seat, Europe. the Mongol. Invasions of Eastern Europe in the 1240s, while Kublai was still a young man and Genghis's son Ögedei was Great Khan, had devastated Poland, Hungary, and parts of what is now Russia. The Battle of Legnica in 1241, where a combined European army was destroyed by Mongol forces, sent genuine panic through the courts of Western Europe. European rulers had two main responses to the Mongol threat. One was military preparation, which was largely inadequate. The other was the remarkable idea that maybe the Mongols could be converted to Christianity, at which point they would stop destroying everything. Several diplomatic missions were sent east by popes and kings. Franciscan friars traveled to the Mongol court carrying letters from the Pope. The letters proposed essentially that Kublai's predecessors might consider accepting baptism and joining the Christian community of nations. The Mongol response to these letters was consistent and not especially encouraging. The Mongols wrote back explaining that they were the chosen instrument of heaven, that all rulers were required to submit to them, and that if the Pope wished to avoid destruction, he should come in person to pay homage. The Pope did not come in person to pay homage. This brings us to a figure who doesn't get quite enough attention in popular history, William of Rubruck. William was a Franciscan friar who traveled to the Mongol court in 1253, a few decades before Marco Polo, on a mission from King Louis IX of France. His account of the journey is one of the most vivid and frankly entertaining pieces of medieval travel writing in existence. William was not a diplomat by nature. He was a friar. He was religious, intellectually curious, somewhat combative when it came to theological arguments, and possessed of a gift for describing what he observed with the kind of direct, unvarnished honesty that diplomatic travel accounts typically lack. He describes the Mongol steppe with wonderful specificity: the felt tents, the diet, the horses, the smell of everything. He describes the fermented mare's milk called kumis, which the Mongols offered as a gesture of hospitality, and which William found deeply challenging. He describes the cold, the distances, the difficulty of the journey with a frankness that makes Marco Polo's account seem rather polished and edited by comparison. When he reached the Mongol court at Karakorum, the capital at this period, he found, to his considerable surprise, a genuinely cosmopolitan place. There were Nestorian Christians who had maintained a presence in Central Asia for centuries. There were Muslims, there were craftsmen from France and Germany and Persia. There was even a Parisian goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher who had been captured somewhere in Eastern Europe and was now, somewhat improbably, making silver automata for the Khan's drinking vessels. William engaged in theological debate with Buddhist monks while Mongol officials watched and bet on the outcome. He describes this with a kind of dry exasperation that reads as genuinely modern. He returned to Europe and wrote a report for King Louis that is, by historical consensus, probably the most accurate first-hand account of the Mongol court produced by any European visitor. He describes things carefully, distinguishes between what he saw himself and what he was told by others, and notes when he was uncertain. Louis IX apparently thanked him and then did nothing useful with the information. Let's take a slight step back from individual travelers and talk about what they were all traveling for, because it's easy to get caught up in the drama of personalities and lose sight of the underlying engine driving all of this movement. Trade. Specifically, silk and spices. These two commodities drove the medieval and early modern global economy in ways that are somewhat difficult to appreciate from the vantage point of a world where you can buy black pepper at any corner shop for almost nothing. In medieval Europe, black pepper was a luxury item. It was used as a preservative, as a flavoring, and as a demonstration of wealth. Pepper was sometimes used as currency. There are records of rents and fines and ransoms paid in pepper. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, one of their demands was 3,000 pounds of pepper, alongside gold and silver. Pepper. They asked for pepper as part of the ransom of Rome. This tells you everything you need to know about the medieval spice trade. Spices came from Southeast Asia and India. Cloves from the Maluku Islands, nutmeg from Banda, pepper from the Malabar coast of India, cinnamon from Ceylon. These were places that most Europeans couldn't have located on a map with any accuracy, which was partly because medieval European maps were somewhat creative in their relationship with geography. The spices traveled from their origin points through a series of intermediaries: Indian merchants, Arab traders, Persian middlemen, Venetian importers. By the time black pepper reached a market in London or Paris, it had passed through perhaps a dozen sets of hands, each taking a markup. The final price bore essentially no relationship to the cost of actually growing the pepper. This was, from the perspective of European consumers, frustrating. From the perspective of the Venetians, who controlled a significant portion of the European end of the spice trade, it was enormously profitable. Venetian wealth in the medieval and early modern period was substantially built on this intermediary role. Venice sat at a perfect geographic position between the Eastern Mediterranean, where Arab and Byzantine traders brought Eastern goods, and the rest of Europe. The Venetians had turned this position into a commercial empire, which is why Venetian merchants like the Polo family were traveling to the east in the first place. They were looking for ways to cut out the middlemen, to trade directly with the source rather than buying through a chain of intermediaries, to understand firsthand where the goods came from and whether direct commercial relationships were possible. In other words, Marco Polo's journey, whatever its exact details, was not fundamentally a journey of curiosity. It was a business trip with a very long layover. Silk is its own fascinating story. The secret of silk production, that it came from the cocoons of silkworms fed on mulberry leaves, was one of the most jealously guarded industrial secrets in human history. China had maintained a monopoly on silk production for centuries. The penalty for smuggling silkworms or their eggs out of China was, for a long time, death. The Byzantine Empire allegedly broke this monopoly in the 6th century CE, when two Nestorian monks smuggled silkworm eggs out of China hidden in hollow walking staffs. This is one of those stories that sounds too perfect to be entirely true, but appears in enough sources to have probably happened in some form. The point is that silk was worth going to extraordinary lengths to obtain, control, and manufacture, because the demand for it was enormous and the profit margins were staggering. The Silk Road, which was never a single road, but a network of routes, got its name from this trade, though it carried many other goods as well: cotton, spices, glass, precious metals, horses, slaves, ideas, religions, diseases. The same routes that carried silk from China to Rome also carried Buddhism from India to China, Islam from the Arabian Peninsula to Central Asia, and eventually, as we noted earlier, plague from Central Asia to Europe. Trade routes are neutral. They carry whatever people put on them. Let's talk about the city that for centuries sat at one of the most important junctions of this trade: Samarkand. Samarkand is one of those cities that appears constantly in the background of medieval history, getting conquered by a succession of empires and somehow always surviving to be conquered by the next one. It was taken by Alexander the Great. It was taken by the Arabs and converted to Islam. It was taken by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, who partially destroyed it. It was rebuilt. It was taken by Timur Tamerlane in the 14th century, who made it his capital and transformed it into one of the most magnificent cities in the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta visited Samarkand and describes it with admiration. Marco Polo passed through the general region. The city was, for medieval travelers moving between the Mediterranean world and China, essentially unavoidable. Tamerlane deserves a moment here because he is another figure who sits at the intersection of everything we've been discussing: the Mongol legacy, the Silk Road, the movement of peoples and powers across Central Asia. Tamerlane, his real name was Timur, meaning iron, was born around 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan. He was of Mongol and Turkic heritage, though this mixture would be a source of some political sensitivity throughout his career, since he wasn't a direct Mongol descendant and had to navigate questions of legitimacy carefully. He made up for this uncertainty by being spectacularly, almost incomprehensibly, violent. Tamerlane built his empire through a series of campaigns across Central Asia, Persia, India, the Levant, and Anatolia that are characterized by a scale of destruction that, even measured against the general violence of the medieval world, is impressive. His campaigns against the Delhi Sultanate in 1398, in which he sacked Delhi and killed a very large number of its inhabitants, with estimates ranging widely but suggesting massacres in the tens of thousands, left northern India devastated. For generations, he defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 and reportedly kept him in a cage, or possibly used him as a footstool, depending on which sources you read. The cage story is probably apocryphal. Later Ottoman historians found it appropriately humiliating to include. But the defeat itself was catastrophically real and threw the Ottoman Empire into a succession crisis that delayed their recovery. By decades, Tamerlane left pyramids of skulls outside the cities he conquered. This was a deliberate policy. He wanted it known what resistance cost. It was terror as infrastructure. And yet, and here is where history's complexity becomes really interesting, Tamerlane was also a significant patron of art, architecture, and scholarship. He brought craftsmen and scholars to Samarkand from across the conquered territories. The Timurid dynasty he founded produced some of the most beautiful architecture in Central Asia. His grandson Ulugh Beg was a serious astronomer who built an observatory and produced star catalogues of impressive accuracy. The man who left pyramids of skulls across Persia and India was also the grandfather of a dynasty that sponsored art and science. History insists on being more complicated than our categories for it. Tamerlane died in 1405 while planning an invasion of China. He was approximately 68 years old, though like many figures from this era, the exact dates are somewhat uncertain. He died not in battle but of fever during a winter march toward China through brutal cold. He was buried in Samarkand in the Guri Amir Mausoleum, which still stands and is one of the most beautiful buildings in Central Asia. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, possibly not, that an inscription on his tomb warned that whoever disturbed it would unleash a conqueror worse than Tamerlane himself. Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb in June 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union 3 days later. This is almost certainly a coincidence. But it's the kind of almost certainly coincidence that history provides with perfect timing. Let's now turn our attention to the other end of the Silk Road, to the medieval Islamic world that Ibn Battuta moved through and that provided much of the intellectual and commercial backbone of the medieval trading network. The period roughly between 800 and 1200 CE is sometimes called the Islamic Golden Age, and while that phrase carries some of the same oversimplification risks as any historical label, it points at something real. During this period, Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate was one of the most sophisticated cities in the world. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, was an institution where scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, conducted original research in mathematics and astronomy and medicine, and produced work that would eventually flow back into European intellectual life and shape the Renaissance. Algebra was developed in this context. The word itself comes from the Arabic al-Jabr, from the title of a book by Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi, who worked at the House of Wisdom in the 9th century. The word algorithm comes from a Latin transliteration of his name. Every time you do algebra, you are carrying the echo of 9th century Baghdad: optics, astronomy, medicine, geography. The medieval Islamic scholarly tradition made fundamental contributions to all of these. Ibn Battuta was not a scholar, but he moved through a world rich with the products of this intellectual culture. The cities he visited, Cairo, Damascus, Delhi, Timbuktu, were places where scholarship was valued and supported. Cairo, which Ibn Battuta visited multiple times and clearly adored, deserves special mention. By the 14th century, Cairo was one of the largest cities in the world, possibly the largest outside of China. It was the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, a remarkable political entity in which the rulers were former military slaves who had seized power and maintained a dynasty through a system in which each generation of rulers was effectively a new set of former slaves who had risen through the military. This sounds unstable, and in some ways it was, but the Mamluks were also, from a military perspective, genuinely formidable. They had stopped the Mongol advance into the Middle East at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, one of the few decisive defeats the Mongols suffered during their period of expansion, and they maintained a powerful state in Egypt and Syria for 2.5 centuries. Cairo under the Mamluks was wealthy, culturally vibrant, architecturally ambitious. The mosques and madrasas built during this period are among the finest examples of Islamic architecture anywhere. The scholarly institutions were excellent. The markets were extensive. Ibn Battuta describes the city with visible pleasure. He uses a phrase that translates roughly as the mother of cities, which might be a compliment he applies to several cities but seems particularly heartfelt when applied to Cairo. He also describes the impact of the Black Death on Cairo during his later visits, when the city that had seemed so vital and full was diminished by plague mortality. It's one of the more affecting passages in his account, precisely because the contrast between the Cairo of his earlier visits and the Cairo devastated by plague is so stark. We've talked about the Black Death as a traveling companion of our subject, something that was always there in the background of the 14th century, shaping everything around it. Now let's look at it directly. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347. It left in the mid-1350s, more or less, though it would return in periodic outbreaks for the next 3 centuries. The initial wave was the worst. In 5 years, approximately 25 to 30 million people died in Europe alone. This represented somewhere between a third and half of the population of the continent. Some regions lost more than half their people. Some villages were completely emptied. Some cities lost 2/3 of their inhabitants. To put this in terms that might make it concrete, if a European city had a population of 50,000 people in 1347, by 1352 it might have 25,000, or 20,000, or fewer. And the dying had been spread across every family, every household, every layer of society. Kings died, bishops died, the brilliant and the powerful died alongside the poor and the obscure. The plague did not make class distinctions. It was one of the few equalizing forces medieval society ever encountered, and it was absolutely terrible. The cause of the Black Death, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, was not understood at the time. Nobody in 1347 knew about bacteria. They didn't have the conceptual framework. What people in 1347 believed about the plague depended heavily on their cultural and intellectual context. In the Christian world, the dominant explanation was divine punishment. God was displeased with humanity, which, given the general moral state of medieval Europe, was not an entirely unreasonable concern, and was expressing this displeasure in the most direct possible way. The appropriate response was prayer, penance, and procession. Some groups took this logic further than others. The flagellants, groups of men who traveled from town to town, publicly flogging themselves as acts of penance, became a significant phenomenon during the Black Death years. They were trying to demonstrate sufficient suffering to persuade God to relent. It didn't work, but one appreciates the commitment. Other groups, looking for a human cause rather than a divine one, blamed the Jewish communities of Europe. This was not the first time in European history that Jewish communities had been blamed for catastrophes they had nothing to do with, and it would not be the last. Pogroms, violent persecutions, spread across Germany and France and other parts of Europe. Entire Jewish communities were killed. This was one of the worst episodes of anti-Semitic violence in European history prior to the 20th century. The East Art medical establishment, such as it was, offered various explanations involving bad air, celestial conjunctions, and the theory of miasmas, that disease spread through foul-smelling air rather than through contact. This led to the famous plague doctor costume, the beaked mask, which was stuffed with herbs and aromatic materials, which was an entirely ineffective intervention against a disease spread by fleas, but was extremely memorable as an aesthetic statement. The economic and social consequences of the Black Death were, in the long run, profound and in some ways unexpected. Losing a third to a half of the population is, obviously, catastrophic in the immediate term, but the survivors found themselves in a changed world. Labor was suddenly scarce. Peasants who had previously been bound to the land by the economic logic of extreme surplus population now had something they'd never had before: bargaining power. If you're a surviving peasant in 1355 and your lord needs people to work his fields, and there simply aren't enough people to go around, you can negotiate. You can ask for better terms. You can leave if you don't get them and find a better situation elsewhere. This is one of the origins of the gradual decline of serfdom in Western Europe. The plague didn't end feudalism, but it cracked the economic logic that had sustained it. Land became cheaper, labor became more expensive, wages rose, living standards for surviving commoners improved. This is cold comfort if you lost your entire family to the plague, but it's a real historical dynamic. The trauma also accelerated certain cultural shifts. Medieval European culture had always lived in the shadow of death. Life expectancies were short, infant mortality was high, disease was constant. But the Black Death sharpened this awareness to a particular intensity. The danse macabre, the dance of death, became a major artistic motif. Images of skeletons leading people of all social classes in a dance toward death appeared in churches and manuscripts across Europe. The message was explicit. Death comes for everyone equally, rich and poor, king and beggar, bishop and prostitute. There's something almost democratic about the danse macabre in the grimmest possible way. Now let's go back to the Mongols for a moment, because the relationship between the Mongol Empire and the Black Death is more complex than simply the trade routes spread the plague. The Mongol expansion in the 13th century had created the conditions for the Black Death in a very specific way. The vast territories controlled by the Mongols included regions of Central Asia, where Yersinia pestis was endemic in rodent populations. These were areas of relatively thin human habitation where the bacterium circulated among rodents without having much opportunity to jump to humans. The Mongol peace, the increased connectivity and trade the empire made possible, essentially created highways along which the plague could travel once it did make the jump to human populations. There's also evidence that the Mongols may have directly facilitated the plague's spread in warfare. The siege of Kaffa, a Genoese trading port in Crimea in 1346, is one of the earliest documented appearances of the plague in Europe. The Mongol forces besieging the city were reportedly dying of plague. According to one contemporary account, they catapulted the plague-infected corpses of their dead over the walls of Kaffa into the city. This is one of the earliest recorded instances of what we might call biological warfare. Whether the Genoese defenders of Kaffa really fled and brought the plague to Sicily, as that same account claims, or whether the plague arrived in Italy by other routes as well, is debated by historians. But the siege of Kaffa sits at the start of the European plague story. The Mongols, in this reading, brought the plague to Europe partly through the same networks of connectivity they had created. The Silk Road was a conduit for goods, for people, for ideas, and for disease. You couldn't have one without the other. By the time of the Black Death's peak in the late 1340s, the Mongol Empire that Marco Polo had traveled through was already fracturing into successor states. The Great Khanate in China, the Yuan dynasty, was under pressure from within. The Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppe was involved in its own internal conflicts. The Ilkhanate in Persia had already collapsed and been replaced by a series of smaller states. The world that Marco Polo described, unified, administered, commercially connected, was breaking up. This fragmentation had several causes. Succession. Disputes among Genghis Khan's descendants were constant and often violent. The size of the empire made unified rule genuinely difficult, and the conversion of various Mongol rulers to Islam, particularly in the western Khanates, created religious divisions that added to political ones. The Black Death also hit the Mongol-controlled areas hard. The steppe populations were not immune to plague, and the same mobility that made the Mongols militarily effective made them efficient plague vectors. By 1368, when the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan in China, the unified Mongol Empire that had briefly connected the world from the Pacific to the Danube was essentially gone. What remained were successor states, the Golden Horde, various Timurid and Ilkhanid fragments, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, each operating independently, each gradually assimilating into the local cultures they had conquered. The Mongol moment was over. The Ming dynasty that replaced the Yuan in China took a very different approach to foreign engagement. Where the Yuan had been open to foreign trade and foreign visitors, which is why Marco Polo could show up and apparently get a government job, the early Ming rulers were suspicious of foreigners and inclined to restrict trade and contact. There is a fascinating footnote here, though. The early Ming period produced one of the most remarkable maritime expeditions in pre-modern history, the voyages of Zheng He. Zheng He was a Muslim eunuch admiral, a sentence that contains several surprises, who commanded a series of massive treasure fleets beginning in 1405. These fleets traveled to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and down the East African coast. The largest ships in Zheng He's fleet were enormous. Chinese sources describe them as 400 feet long, though modern historians debate the exact dimensions. And the fleet at its peak included hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of men. These were not trading voyages in the European sense. They were diplomatic missions, demonstrations of Ming power, designed to collect tribute and establish relationships of deference from rulers across the Indian Ocean world. Ibn Battuta had traveled the same Indian Ocean routes half a century earlier as an individual pilgrim and scholar. Zheng He was traveling them as the representative of the most powerful state in the world. And then, in 1433, the voyages stopped. The Ming court decided that the treasure fleets were expensive, unnecessary, and potentially politically destabilizing. Successful admirals with large fleets have, historically, been threats to civilian governments. The ships were allowed to rot. The records of the voyages were suppressed or destroyed by court factions opposed to further maritime expansion. China, at the precise moment when European maritime expansion was beginning, turned inward. 60 years later, Vasco da Gama would round the Cape of Good Hope and reach India. European ships would begin arriving in the Indian Ocean, the same waters Zheng He had sailed, and the balance of global power would begin its slow shift westward. History is full of these moments where a road not taken can be seen, in retrospect, as decisive. While all of this was happening, there'd be the Mongol conquests, the Silk Road trade, the Black Death, the Ming withdrawal. The courts of medieval Europe were doing their own peculiar things. We focused on the wider world because that's where the travelers went. But the Europe those travelers left behind and eventually returned to was its own collection of strange, dysfunctional, occasionally brilliant, frequently chaotic political entities. Let's spend some time there. Medieval European kingship had a logic that seems bizarre from the outside but made a certain kind of internal sense. The king was simultaneously a military commander, a religious figure, a judicial authority, a landlord, and a symbol. His body and his kingdom were conceptually linked. The health of the king reflected the health of the realm, which is one of the reasons medieval kings were so obsessive about producing heirs and so devastated by illness. And then there was the small matter of hereditary rule, which required that the monarch's heir be biologically descended from the monarch, which meant that the quality of future rulers was essentially a matter of genetic lottery combined with the question of who the king or queen happened to marry. This led, over centuries, to some remarkable outcomes. Let's talk about the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire famously described as being neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. He wasn't wrong. The Holy Roman Empire was a loose confederation of German-speaking territories, kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, free cities, nominally united under an emperor who was elected by a group of major princes and church figures called the electors. The elected nature of the imperial title was both the Holy Roman Empire's most interesting feature and one of its persistent sources of dysfunction. Unlike in France or England, where the principle of hereditary succession at least provided a reasonably clear mechanism for succession, however often it broke down in practice, the empire's elective system meant that every imperial succession was a negotiation, a bribery contest, and occasionally a small war. The Habsburgs, who dominated the empire from the 15th century onward, solved this problem by being very good at strategic marriages and producing enough children to dominate the pool of candidates for generations. Their motto, attributed to Matthias Corvinus, was Bella gerant ali tu Felix Austria nub. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. This was both accurate and slightly smug. Habsburg marriage policy will become extremely relevant later in this script when we get to the topic of inbreeding and the remarkable medical consequences thereof. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The 14th century in France provided what might be the single most concentrated period of royal catastrophe in European history, which is competitive territory. In 1314, Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, so called because he was genuinely good-looking, which was considered worth noting in a royal dynasty not always blessed in this department, died. He left 3 adult sons to succeed him. All 3 sons died within 14 years, without producing surviving male heirs. This was, dynastically, a disaster. The Capetian dynasty that had ruled France since 987 died out in the male line. The question of succession then became, who had the best claim? The answer depended entirely on whether you accepted the principle that kingship could pass through women. If so, then the nearest heir was Edward III of England, who was a grandson of Philip IV through his mother, Isabella. France did not want Edward III of England as their king. France came up with a legal principle, the Salic law, allegedly based on ancient Frankish custom, that barred women and their descendants from inheriting the French throne. Edward III disputed this. The dispute eventually became the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453 and was, as the name suggests, not a brief conflict. The 100 Years' War is one of those events that's so large and so long that it tends to flatten in historical memory into a series of battles, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, and one remarkable individual, Joan of Arc. But it was also a sustained catastrophe for the people who lived through it. The English and French armies moving across the French countryside for a century, the destruction, the taxation to pay for it all, the disease that followed armies like a shadow, and it all started because Philip IV had 3 sons who couldn't keep themselves alive. Speaking of catastrophic French monarchs, let's discuss Charles VI of France, who reigned from 1380 to 1422 and who provides one of the more striking examples of royal mental illness in European history. Charles VI seemed promising at first. He came to the throne as a child, which was not unusual, and showed signs of reasonable intelligence and energy as a young man. He was called Charles the Beloved by his subjects, which suggests at least an adequate early reign. In 1392, when he was 23, he had a psychotic episode while leading an army through a forest. The details are somewhat confused by the sources, but the general picture is, it was hot, a servant made a sudden noise, and Charles attacked his own soldiers, killing 4 of them before he could be subdued. He then fell into a catatonic state. He recovered. Then he relapsed. Then he recovered. Then he relapsed again. Over the rest of his reign, which lasted another 30 years, Charles VI experienced recurring episodes of psychosis during which he believed he was made of glass and might shatter if anyone touched him. He refused to bathe. He didn't recognize his wife or his children. He ran through the corridors of the palace howling. During the lucid periods between episodes, he was capable enough, though understandably somewhat diminished, by the trauma of his situation. The real power in France during this period was exercised by various factions of princes and nobles who competed, sometimes violently, for control of the government and the person of the king. The French court during the reign of Charles VI was a deeply strange environment. You had a king who was intermittently convinced he was made of glass, surrounded by factions of princes who were willing to murder each other for political advantage, while the English, under the energetic and ruthless Henry I, took advantage of the chaos to win Agincourt and nearly conquer France entirely. Charles II died in 1422, leaving France in a state of crisis. His son would eventually, with the significant assistance of Joan of Arc, stabilize the kingdom and eventually expel the English. But Charles VI's reign illustrates what happens when hereditary monarchy produces a ruler who is genuinely incapable, and nobody has a legitimate mechanism to remove him. You just wait. And manage, and hope the lucid periods last long enough to prevent the worst. While we're discussing royal mental illness with appropriate compassion, let's note that it was genuinely common in European royal families, for reasons that become clearer when you look at marriage patterns. Medieval and early modern European royal families married each other constantly, repeatedly, in patterns of consanguinity, close blood relation, that would make a modern geneticist wince. The reasons were practical. You wanted to marry your children to other royal families because that's how you made alliances and secured succession. But the pool of royal families was limited. Over generations, the same family trees intertwined more and more tightly. The results showed up most dramatically in the later Habsburgs, which we'll get to in some detail. But French, English, Spanish, and virtually every other European royal family showed the same patterns. Royal children were sickly at rates that modern historians can, with some confidence, attribute in part to genetic effects of consanguineous marriage. Royal lines died out with suspicious frequency. Kings who seemed promising in youth became disabled or died young at rates that were, statistically, notable, even accounting for the general harshness of medieval medicine. Let's take a moment with England's own contribution to the archive of royal dysfunction. Richard II of England reigned from 1377 to 1399. He was the grandson of Edward III, who had started the 100 Years' War, and the son of the Black Prince, who had been one of the great military figures of the 14th century. Richard II was not a military figure. He was, by temperament and inclination, an aesthete. He was interested in art and culture. He was a patron of Geoffrey Chaucer, which gives him a solid literary footnote. He is credited with introducing the pocket handkerchief to England, which is either a charming detail or an indictment of pre-Richard personal hygiene, depending on your perspective. He was also increasingly paranoid, erratic, and convinced of his own divine authority to a degree that his nobles found destabilizing. He had his opponents executed or exiled. He ruled by caprice rather than by consultation with the major lords who expected to be consulted. In 1399, while he was on campaign in Ireland, his cousin Henry of Lancaster, later Henry IV, landed in England, gathered support rapidly, and effectively seized the throne. Richard returned to find himself without an army and without meaningful support. He was captured, forced to abdicate, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and died there in early 1400. The cause of death is recorded as voluntary starvation, which may mean he refused food in despair, or may be a diplomatic way of saying something more violent happened. He was 33 years old. His deposition established a pattern that would haunt the English monarchy for the next century. The Wars of the Roses, which grew directly from the contested legitimacy of the Lancastrian dynasty that replaced him. All of this from a king who liked handkerchiefs and didn't want to share power with his nobles. The Wars of the Roses, for those who want to spare themselves the detailed dynastic genealogy. It was a series of civil wars between two branches of the English royal family, both descended from Edward III, called the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The conflict lasted roughly from 1455 to 1485. Multiple kings were crowned, deposed, and killed. It ended when Henry Tudor who had a somewhat tenuous claim to the throne but had the considerable practical advantage of winning the Battle of Bosworth Field, became Henry VII and founded the Tudor dynasty. The roses of the name, white for York, red for Lancaster, were largely a Victorian romantic addition to the historical record. The people fighting the wars didn't call it the Wars of the Roses. They were busy calling it various things that roughly translated to the current catastrophic succession dispute. But the Victorian branding stuck, and now it's the Wars of the Roses forever. Let's turn our attention from England to a monarchy that was, in the late medieval period, in some ways the most powerful in Europe, the Iberian kingdoms that would eventually become Spain. By the end of the 15th century, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had unified the two major Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, a busy year, they completed the Reconquista by taking Granada, the last Muslim-ruled territory in Iberia. They expelled the Jewish population of Spain, and they funded Christopher Columbus's voyage west in search of a route to Asia. 1492 was a remarkable year for Ferdinand and Isabella. They managed in a single year to complete a century-long religious military project, commit one of the largest forced displacements in European history, and inadvertently set in motion the European colonization of the Americas. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain, along with the earlier expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 and France at various points, represents one of the defining catastrophes of medieval Jewish history. The Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula were among the most sophisticated and culturally productive in the world. The Sephardic Jews who were expelled in 1492 scattered across the Mediterranean, to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to Italy, to the Netherlands, and carried with them intellectual and commercial networks that enriched wherever they settled. The Ottoman Empire, which welcomed the Jewish refugees with notable hospitality, reportedly sent thanks to Ferdinand and Isabella for impoverishing Spain so usefully. We've been circling the Habsburgs for several parts now. It's time. The Habsburg dynasty is one of the most successful, and in its final centuries, one of the most medically unfortunate royal families in European history. They dominated European politics from the 15th century through to the 20th, which is a remarkable run, even allowing for the fact that the family name attached to the empire changed over time. But success in politics and success in genetics are not the same thing, and the Habsburgs pursued a marriage strategy that eventually caught up with them in dramatic, measurable ways. Let's start with the jaw. The Habsburg jaw, mandibular prognathism in medical terminology, is one of the most famous genetic traits in European royal history. It's a pronounced protrusion of the lower jaw and underbite that appeared in the Habsburg family in the 15th century and became increasingly pronounced over subsequent generations. It wasn't just cosmetically noticeable. Severe cases made it difficult to chew properly. Some Habsburg rulers required specially modified foods. In the most extreme cases, the jaw protruded so far that closing the mouth fully was difficult. A 2019 study by geneticists and physicians who analyzed historical portraits of Habsburg rulers traced the increasing severity of the jaw deformity across generations and correlated it with the degree of inbreeding. The conclusion was exactly what you'd expect. The more closely related the parents, the more pronounced the jaw. The Habsburgs were essentially a natural experiment in what happens to a genetic trait when it circulates in an increasingly closed population. The Habsburg marriage strategy made genetic sense in the short term. If you married your children to cousins and other close relatives who were already Habsburgs, you kept the family's vast territorial holdings together. You didn't have to share power with other dynasties. You built a self-reinforcing network of inheritance claims. In 1496, Philip of Castile, Philip the Handsome, which, given that he was a Habsburg, requires a brief pause to appreciate, married Joanna of Castile. Philip was the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This marriage united the Spanish crown with the Habsburg dynasty. Their son, Charles V, inherited Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Austrian Habsburg territories, essentially the largest collection of European territories under a single ruler since Charlemagne. He also became Holy Roman Emperor. Charles V was, in the short term, evidence for the Habsburg marriage strategy working. He was capable, energetic, and governed an enormous empire for decades. He was also, genealogically, quite closely related to himself. His parents, Philip and Joanna, were second cousins. Several of his grandparents appeared multiple times in his family tree when you traced it back a few generations. The inbreeding coefficient, a measure used in genetics to describe how closely related a person's parents are, was measurable in Charles V, and it would increase substantially in his descendants. Joanna of Castile, who is known to history as Joanna the Mad, is one of the more tragic figures in this already somewhat grim story. Joanna was by most accounts a perfectly intelligent woman who was, in certain respects, mentally unwell. The extent to which her mental illness was real, and the extent to which it was a political construction, a convenient narrative that allowed others to remove her from power and govern in her name, is something historians still debate. What is not disputed is that after her husband Philip died, suddenly in 1506 at the age of 28, Joanna entered a prolonged state of grief and dysfunction that gave those around her, principally her father Ferdinand, and then her son Charles, the political opening they needed to declare her incapable of ruling. She was confined, effectively, for the rest of her life. She was the nominal Queen of Castile until her death in 1555, 49 years of confinement, but power was exercised by others in her name. Whether Joanna was mentally ill or grief-stricken and traumatized by the people manipulating her, or some combination of both, is a question that her story doesn't quite answer. The sources are largely written by people who had interests in portraying her as incapable. What we can say is that she was a woman in a position of great nominal power who was effectively imprisoned for half a century, and that the men around her found this arrangement entirely convenient. The end point of the Habsburg marriage strategy is usually considered to be Charles II of Spain, who reigned from 1665 to 1700, and who represents the biological conclusion of several generations of close cousin and uncle-niece marriages. Charles II was, by most historical assessments, one of the most physically and mentally afflicted rulers in European history, and the Habsburg lineage had produced some significant competition for this title. He could not walk until age 8. He could not speak until age 10. He had severe learning difficulties. He was described by contemporaries as having almost exactly the classic Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form. His tongue was so large for his mouth that he drooled constantly, and could barely be understood when he spoke. He suffered from recurring illnesses throughout his life. His hair and teeth were in poor condition. He was infertile. He is sometimes called El Hechizado, the bewitched, because his contemporaries found his condition so extreme that supernatural explanation seemed necessary. It was not supernatural. A 2009 genetic analysis estimated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254, meaning that roughly 25% of his genetic loci were homozygous due to recent inbreeding. For comparison, the inbreeding coefficient of a child of first cousins is approximately 0.0625. Charles II's coefficient was 4 times that. His parents were uncle and niece. His maternal grandparents were also cousins with their own inbreeding history. The family tree, if you tried to draw it, would look less like a tree and more like a diagram of something that had been folded several times. Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, which the Habsburgs had done everything to prevent and everything to bring about simultaneously. The extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which involved most of the major European powers and reshaped the political map of Europe, all because of a marriage strategy that had optimized for political consolidation and not noticed. because nobody understood genetics in the 17th century, that it was destroying the family's biological viability. This is one of those cases where you find yourself wanting to go back in time and explain Mendelian genetics to a 16th century Habsburg court. And then you remember that the information wouldn't necessarily have been useful anyway, because the political pressures driving the marriage decisions were real and the genetic consequences were invisible to everyone involved. The Habsburgs weren't uniquely foolish. They were operating with the knowledge available to them in a political context that made their choices rational. The consequences were tragic. Let's turn to someone who was watching Habsburg Spain's dominance of the late 16th century with mounting anxiety and eventual violent opposition: the Dutch. The Netherlands in the 16th century were among the wealthiest territories in the Habsburg Empire. The Dutch towns were commercial centers of extraordinary productivity. Antwerp was arguably the most important trading city in Northern Europe. The population was literate, commercially sophisticated, and religiously mixed. Calvinism had taken strong root, which meant a significant portion of the population had theological reasons to distrust a Spanish Catholic crown. When Philip II of Spain, Charles V's son, himself a Habsburg, with a notable jaw, attempted to enforce religious conformity and increase taxation on the Netherlands, he got a revolution. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, beginning in the 1560s, eventually produced an independent Dutch republic after a war lasting about 80 years. The 80 Years' War. Not a brief conflict. The Dutch Republic that emerged from this conflict was one of the most remarkable political entities in the 17th century. It was a republic, genuinely, meaningfully, not a monarchy, in an age when virtually every European power of any significance was a monarchy. It was commercially oriented, religiously tolerant by the standards of the time, and intellectually open in ways that made it a magnet for thinkers, scientists, and refugees from less tolerant places. Spinoza worked in Amsterdam. Descartes spent significant time in the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic was, for a few decades in the 17th century, possibly the freest and most intellectually vibrant place in Europe. It was also building a trading empire that would, for a period, dominate the spice trade that had been the underlying commercial motivation for so much of the story we've been telling. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, was in some respects the first modern corporation. It issued shares, had a formal governance structure, and raised capital from public investors. It also established trading posts across Asia through methods that ranged from commercial negotiation to military violence, and it controlled, at its height, the clove and nutmeg trade from the Maluku Islands, with a monopoly that was enforced with considerable ruthlessness. The Banda Islands massacre of 1621, in which Dutch forces killed most of the indigenous nutmeg farming population of the islands in order to establish complete control of the nutmeg trade, is one of the more extreme instances of commercial violence in the early modern period. Nutmeg. This happened over nutmeg. Though, to be fair to the Dutch East India Company's logic, nutmeg was worth a great deal of money at the time, and monopoly control of its supply was an enormously profitable position. The VOC was optimizing for profit, with all the violence that optimization could lead to when there was no meaningful external constraint on corporate behavior. We're in the home stretch now, which means we can step back from the individual stories and let things breathe a little. Tonight, we've traveled from Marco Polo's possibly invented journey to the genetic consequences of Habsburg marriage policy. We've visited the Black Death and Kublai Khan and Ibn Battuta, and the fall of Constantinople, and the founding of the first modern corporation over nutmeg. What connects all of it? The answer, roughly, is this. The centuries between roughly 1250 and 1650 were the period during which the world became connected. Not fully connected, that would take longer, but connected in a new and increasingly permanent way. Trade. Routes that had existed for centuries became more organized. Empires of greater geographic scale than previously possible emerged and linked previously separate regions. Ideas, religions, diseases, technologies began moving faster and farther than they ever had. This connectivity was, simultaneously, one of the most creative and one of the most destructive forces in human history. The same connections that carried silk and spices and mathematical ideas also carried plague and smallpox and enslaved people. The same ships that opened the Americas to European knowledge also opened the Americas to European disease and violence. There is no version of this story that's entirely celebratory, and there's no version that's entirely condemnatory. It was a vast, complex, often terrible, often remarkable set of things that happened, and we are all, wherever we are in the world tonight, living in its consequences. Let's spend a little time with Japan, which we mentioned briefly in the context of Kublai Khan's invasions and then left behind. Japan in the medieval period is one of those parts of world history that doesn't get as much attention in Western historical education as it deserves, partly because it existed in relative isolation from the Silk Road world we've been discussing, and partly because the European encounter with Japan came later than the encounter with China or India. Japan's medieval period, roughly the 12th through 16th centuries, was dominated by the samurai class and a series of military governments called shogunates. The emperor existed but held largely ceremonial power. Real authority was exercised by the shogun, the supreme military commander, and the web of feudal relationships among samurai lords that supported and contested his power. This sounds from a distance like European feudalism, and there are genuine structural similarities. Both systems involved warrior classes holding land in exchange for military service. Both involved hierarchies of lords and vassals. Both produced complex codes of honor and conduct that were as much about managing violence within the system as about anything else. The differences are just as interesting as the similarities. Japanese Buddhism produced cultural and aesthetic traditions entirely unlike anything in European Christianity. The Japanese approach to warfare, the katana, the particular codes of samurai conduct, the aesthetic dimension of martial culture, was distinct from European chivalric traditions in ways that are genuinely interesting rather than merely decorative. The Sengoku period, the Warring States era of Japanese history, roughly 1467 to 1615, was a century and a half of near-continuous civil war among competing feudal lords, each trying to unify Japan under his control. It's one of the most intensively studied periods of Japanese history and has produced an industry of novels, films, and video games for very good reasons. The figures it produced are extraordinary. Oda Nobunaga, who came closest to unifying Japan, before being assassinated in 1582. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of low birth who rose through military merit to become the most powerful person in Japan, which in a rigid hierarchical society was genuinely remarkable. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who succeeded where the others had fallen short, and established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. The Tokugawa shogunate lasted until 1868, 2.5 centuries of relative peace and social stability. It also enforced during much of this period a policy of sakoku, closed country, that severely restricted foreign trade and contact. Japanese were prohibited from leaving Japan. Foreign merchants were restricted to designated trading posts. The Dutch, who had proved themselves willing to work within Tokugawa rules without the religious complications the Catholic Portuguese and Spanish brought, were given a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbor called Dejima. Japan closed itself to the world at roughly the same time that the world was becoming most actively connected. Whether this was wise or unwise is one of those questions historians find genuinely interesting. It preserved Japanese society from many of the disruptions that contact with European commercial and military power brought to other parts of Asia. It also meant that when Japan did reopen, under American pressure in 1853, it found itself confronting an industrialized world that had changed enormously while Japan had been maintaining its internal stability. The response, the Meiji Restoration, was one of the most rapid and deliberate modernizations in history. But that's a story for another night. Let's come back to the question we started with and let it expand a little. Did Marco Polo lie about everything? Probably not. He probably traveled extensively. He probably reached Central Asia at least. He probably saw and recorded many things accurately. His account, whatever its exact relationship to his actual experience, contained enough accurate information about the East to be genuinely useful to Europeans trying to understand the world. But the question is really a smaller version of a larger question. How do we know things about the past? How do we evaluate sources? How do we hold historical accounts that are partly accurate and partly embellished, produced by people with their own interests and perspectives and limitations, and still extract something true from them? This is the fundamental problem of history. Every account is filtered. Every document was written by someone with purposes we may only partially understand, in contexts that shaped what they chose to record and what they chose to omit. Ibn Battuta, who traveled more than Marco Polo and whose account is in some ways more detailed, has his own gaps and possibly embellishments. William of Rubruck, who was probably more careful and honest than either, still saw everything through the lens of a 13th century Franciscan friar with specific theological convictions. The historians who study these accounts, Francis Wood, arguing against Marco Polo going to China, the scholars who reconstruct Ibn Battuta's itinerary from internal evidence, are themselves working from their own perspectives, their own assumptions, their own professional contexts. History is not a fixed story. It's an ongoing argument about the meaning and accuracy of the evidence we have. This should perhaps be reassuring rather than discouraging. If the past was simple, it would be less interesting. The questions we can't fully answer. Did Marco Polo go to China? What exactly happened at the siege of Kaffa? How much of Ibn Battuta's account is accurate? Keep us engaged. They remind us that the people of the past were as complex and uncertain and self-interested as we are. The Kublai Khan who invited Marco Polo to his court was not a storybook villain or a storybook hero. He was an aging, gout-afflicted man trying to govern an enormous empire that was beginning to fray at its edges, surrounded by courtiers with competing interests, dealing with failed military campaigns and succession questions, and the general difficulty of running the largest land empire in history. The Charles VI of France, who believed he was made of glass, was not a cartoon madman. He was a person with a serious mental illness being failed by everyone around him, by medicine that had no useful tools, by a political system that required a functioning monarch and had no mechanism to manage an incapacitated one, by family members who exploited his illness for political advantage. The Joanna of Castile, confined for 49 years, was not definitively mad or definitively sane. She was a complicated person in an impossible situation. These people were real. The distance of centuries makes them seem like characters in a story, but they had the same interior experience of being alive that we do. The same uncertainty, the same pain, the same occasional flashes of pleasure and connection. It's late, or it should be, if you've been listening for a while. The lights should be dim. The world outside should be quiet, or at least quieter than it is during the day. We've been from Venice to Beijing, from Morocco to the court of Kublai Khan, from the Black Death to the Habsburg Jaw. We've passed through the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean and the Spanish court and medieval Japan. We've met travelers and conquerors and mentally ill kings and imprisoned queens and one gout-afflicted emperor who never managed to conquer Japan despite really trying. History at this scale has a rhythm to it. Things rise and fall, connections form and break. People travel extraordinary distances and record what they see, accurately or not. Empires of extraordinary power collapse eventually into something else. The world Marco Polo described, even if he partly invented it, is unrecognizable today. The Mongol Empire is gone. The Silk Road as a functioning commercial network is largely gone, replaced by container ships and cargo planes. Kublai Khan's Beijing is buried under layers of subsequent construction. Venice is a tourist destination and, yet the impulse that sent Marco Polo east, the desire to understand what lay beyond the known world, to make contact with the other, to trade and learn and record, is not gone. It's just taken different forms. We are, all of us, still traveling. Even when we're lying still in the dark, listening to someone tell us stories about the past. Sleep well, friends. The world will still be here in the morning, complicated and strange and full of things we don't quite understand. It always is.